The gunshot that shattered the dawn silence sent birds scattering into the pale Colorado sky as Zachary Turner squinted through the haze of gun smoke. The year was 1878, and like the dust that perpetually coated his worn leather boots, the weight of his past followed him across the rugged terrain of the western frontier. "That's the fourth rattler this week," Zachary muttered, holstering his Colt revolver with practiced ease. The snake lay dead at his feet, its diamond pattern still glistening in the early morning light. His ranch hands would be up soon, but these quiet moments belonged to him alone, moments when memories couldn't be drowned in whiskey or buried beneath the day's labor. At 32, Zachary had carved out a decent living for himself in Silver Creek, Colorado. His cattle ranch wasn't the largest in the territory, but it was respectable, profitable enough to employ 6 ranch hands and a cook. Most folks in town knew him as the quiet rancher who kept to himself, paid fair wages, and occasionally shared a bottle with Sheriff Miller at the Rusty Spur Saloon. Few knew where he'd come from, and no one knew what he was running from. The sun crested over the eastern hills as he made his way back to the main house, a sturdy 2-story structure of timber and stone he'd built with his own hands. The smell of coffee and bacon greeted him as he stepped through the door, where old Roy was already at work in the kitchen. "Heard a shot," Roy said without looking up from the stove. The weathered cook had ridden with Zachary for 5 years now, and at 67 claimed he was too old to learn new tricks or ask unnecessary questions. "Rattlesnake," Zachary replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Gettin' to be that time of year," Roy nodded. "Oh, nearly forgot. Letter came yesterday with the supply wagon. Put it on your desk." Zachary's brow furrowed. He rarely received mail, and when he did, it seldom brought good news. Making his way to the small study off the main room, he found the envelope sitting on the worn oak desk. The return address made his stomach tighten: Denver, Colorado Territory Office of Land Management. The contents were brief but clear. The railroad was coming through, and surveyors would be arriving within the week to map the proposed route. His property sat directly in their path of interest. It wasn't condemnation, not yet, but Zachary knew how these things typically ended. The railroads got what they wanted, one way or another. "Damn it all," he muttered, crushing the letter in his fist. He'd spent 7 years building this place, creating a sanctuary far from the ghosts of his past. Now strangers would be tramping across his land, bringing questions and complications. After breakfast, he rode out with his foreman, Miguel Sanchez, to check on the herd. The cattle were fat and healthy, grazing peacefully in the lower meadow. It would be a good year for prices if the railroad didn't upend everything. "You seem troubled, patron," Miguel observed as they watched the cattle from horseback. "Railroads sending surveyors," Zachary replied, "might be looking to cut through the east pasture." Miguel crossed himself. "My father lost his land to the railroad in Texas. They offer little and take much." "This time might be different," Zachary said, though he didn't believe it. Nothing ever changed when it came to men with money and power. He'd learned that lesson too well in another life. They were riding back when they spotted the cloud of dust approaching from the direction of town. A wagon was making its way toward the ranch at a steady pace. Zachary frowned. He wasn't expecting deliveries, and visitors were rare. "Go on back," he told Miguel. "I'll see what this is about." As the wagon drew closer, Zachary could make out 2 figures on the seat, a man driving and what appeared to be a woman beside him. The sight quickened his pulse. Women were scarce in Silver Creek, and none had reason to call at his ranch. The wagon rolled to a stop 20 yards from where Zachary waited on horseback. The driver, a balding man in his 50s wearing a neat black suit despite the heat, climbed down first. "Mr. Turner," the man called, removing his hat. "Edgar Williams, representing the Western Pacific Railroad Company." He gestured to his companion, who was now climbing down from the wagon seat. "And this is Miss Alexandra Kincaid, our company cartographer and surveyor." Zachary's attention shifted to the woman, and for a moment, he forgot to breathe. She was not what he expected a railroad surveyor to look like. Dressed in practical riding clothes, a long skirt divided for riding, and a crisp white blouse beneath a fitted jacket, she moved with confident grace. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed but couldn't conceal striking green eyes. "Mr. Turner," she said, extending a gloved hand. Her voice carried traces of an Eastern education. "Thank you for allowing us onto your property." "I don't recall giving permission," Zachary replied, ignoring her outstretched hand. He remained mounted, a deliberate choice to maintain the advantage of height. If his rudeness bothered her, she didn't show it. Instead, she lowered her hand and smiled, not the placating smile of someone seeking to charm, but the determined expression of a person accustomed to resistance. "The letter from the land management office should have arrived by now," she said. "We're here to conduct a preliminary survey for the proposed railroad extension. I assure you will be as unintrusive as possible." "The letter arrived this morning," Zachary said. "Seems awful quick for you to follow on its heels." Williams cleared his throat nervously. "Efficiency is the cornerstone of progress, Mr. Turner. Miss Kincaid here is one of the finest surveyors in the country. Denver to San Francisco in 10 days less than the current route, that's what we're aiming for." Zachary's eyes narrowed. "And my ranch happens to be in the way of this." "Efficiency? Not necessarily," Alexandra Kincaid interjected, stepping forward. "That's why we're here to determine the most viable route. There are several possibilities we're exploring." Something in her direct gaze made Zachary uneasy. He'd built walls around himself for years, and this woman seemed the type to look for cracks. "You can make camp by the creek," he said finally, nodding toward the west. "Stay clear of the cattle and the main house. I'll have one of my men show you the property boundaries. How long will this take?" 3 days, perhaps 4, she answered. "Depending on the terrain and what we find, what they might find." The words hung in the air, and Zachary felt a chill despite the warm day. Some things were buried deep, but never deep enough. "Mr. Williams will be returning to town," Alexandra continued. "I'll be conducting the survey with my assistant, who should arrive tomorrow. We've brought our own supplies and won't trouble you for anything." "A woman alone on a cattle ranch," Zachary raised an eyebrow, "seems improper." A flash of irritation crossed her face. "I've surveyed across 3 territories, Mr. Turner. I assure you, propriety takes a backseat to precision in my profession. But if it concerns you, I'll be sure to maintain a respectable distance from your sensibilities." Williams looked distinctly uncomfortable at the exchange. "Miss Kincaid's reputation is beyond reproach, Mr. Turner. The company vouches for her character and expertise." Zachary studied her for a moment longer, then nodded curtly. "Your camp, your business, just stay out of mine." He turned his horse and rode toward the house without looking back. That evening, from his porch, Zachary watched the small campfire by the creek. The woman Alexandra moved efficiently around the site, setting up what appeared to be surveying equipment. Even from a distance, there was something compelling about her, a sense of purpose in every movement. Roy brought coffee to the porch and followed Zachary's gaze. "Railroad folks causing trouble already? Not yet," Zachary replied. "But they will." "Pretty young lady," Roy observed, a hint of amusement in his weathered voice. "Can't remember the last time a woman like that set foot on this property. She's not here for social calls. She's here to map a way to cut this ranch in two." Roy sipped his coffee. "Maybe. Or maybe the railroad will go around. You ever think of that? Railroads don't go around, Roy. They go through and they take what they want." Zachary stood abruptly. "I'm turning in. Wake me at first light." But sleep eluded him that night. His dreams were filled with ghosts from his past faces of men he'd killed, the screams of women and children he couldn't save, the searing pain of betrayal. And somehow, threading through these familiar nightmares was a new element, a pair of green eyes, searching, questioning, seeing too much. Alexandra Kincaid rose before dawn, accustomed to making the most of daylight hours in her work. She'd slept soundly despite the unfamiliar surroundings, her camp bed comfortable enough after a long day of travel. The morning air was crisp with the promise of another warm day as she built up the fire and set coffee to boil. Her position with the railroad had raised eyebrows, of course. A female surveyor was unusual, but her father's reputation and her own undeniable skill had opened doors normally closed to women. William Kincaid had been one of the most respected surveyors in Boston before his death 3 years earlier, and Alexandra had apprenticed under him since she was 16. Now, at 28, she had established herself in her own right, though each new assignment still brought the familiar challenge of proving herself. This particular project was important. The new rail line would connect several growing settlements and create a more direct route to California. The terrain was challenging, but she'd faced worse in Montana. What troubled her more was the rancher, Zachary Turner. There was something in his eyes, a wariness that went beyond the typical landowner's concern about property rights. She'd met plenty of hostile ranchers and farmers in her work, men who saw the railroad as a threat to their way of life. But Turner's resistance felt different, personal somehow. Alexandra was studying her maps when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Turner riding toward her camp, silhouetted against the rising sun. Even at a distance, there was something compelling about him, a natural authority in the way he sat his horse, controlled yet alert, like a predator at rest. "Good morning, Mr. Turner," she called as he drew near. He reined in his horse but didn't dismount. "You're up early. Daylight is valuable in my line of work." She gestured to the coffee pot. "Would you care for some coffee?" After a moment's hesitation, he swung down from the saddle. Up close, she could better appreciate the contradictions in his appearance. His clothes were simple worn jeans, a faded blue shirt, scuffed boots but of good quality. His face was sun-darkened and weathered, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into the distance. Yet there was a refinement to his features that hinted at an education or upbringing beyond the typical frontier rancher. "You said your assistant arrives today?" he asked, accepting the tin cup she offered. "Yes, Thomas Parker. He handles the equipment and assists with measurements." She watched as Turner sipped the coffee, his eyes scanning her camp. "Is there something specific you're concerned about, Mr. Turner?" His blue eyes shifted to her face. "Just wondering what exactly you'll be doing on my land." "Measuring distances, evaluating grades, assessing soil composition, charting water sources, all the factors that determine whether railroad construction is viable." She spread her map on a flat rock nearby. "May I show you?" He approached cautiously, as if the map might bite. Alexandra pointed to the various routes marked in different colors. The red line follows the existing stage route, but the grade is too steep in several places. The blue uses the river valley, but spring flooding is a concern. Her finger traced the green line that cut across the eastern portion of what she knew to be his property. "This route offers the most consistent grade and the fewest natural obstacles." "And cuts my ranch in half," he observed. "Potentially," she acknowledged. "Though there would be compensation, of course, and guaranteed crossing points for your cattle." "Compensation," he repeated, a bitter edge to his voice. "Tell me, Miss Kincaid, how does one compensate a man for taking what he's built with his own hands?" The question seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere concern over property. Alexandra studied his face, noting the tension in his jaw, the shadow that passed over his expression. "That's not a question I can answer, Mr. Turner. I only determine what's possible, not what's right." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "An honest answer, at least." "I don't deal in false promises," she replied. "My job is to provide facts. What the company does with those facts and how they treat the people affected is beyond my control." "Yet you work for them?" "I work for myself, Mr. Turner. The railroad is merely my client." She folded the map carefully. "I understand your concerns. This land means something to you beyond its material value." For a moment, something vulnerable flickered in his eyes. Then the shutters came down. "Land's just land, Miss Kincaid. Some men have it, some men want it, some men take it. And which are you, Mr. Turner?" His lips curved into what might have been a smile under different circumstances. "I'm just a man trying to raise cattle in peace." He handed back the empty cup. "Your coffee's good, better than what Roy makes." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Alexandra with more questions than answers about the enigmatic rancher. Later that morning, Thomas Parker arrived with additional equipment and supplies. A thin, energetic young man of 23, he'd worked with Alexandra for over a year and had proven himself both capable and respectful, a rare combination in her experience with male assistants. "This is quite the spread," Thomas remarked as they began their first survey line. "Owner seemed hospitable enough when I passed the main house. Older fellow offered me breakfast." "That would be Roy, the cook," Alexandra replied, adjusting the transit. "Mr. Turner himself is less welcoming. Usual story, doesn't want the railroad cutting up his kingdom." "Perhaps," she said, making a notation in her field book. "But there's something else, something he's not saying," Thomas grinned. "Always the detective, Miss Kincaid. Not every mystery needs solving, you know." "In my experience, Thomas, understanding the terrain includes understanding the people who inhabit it. Now, let's get this baseline established before the day gets any hotter." They worked steadily through the morning, mapping the eastern section of the property. Alexandra was impressed with the land, fertile grazing areas, well-managed water sources, strategically placed windbreaks. Zachary Turner might be guarded and brusque, but he was clearly a skilled rancher who understood this land intimately. Around midday, as they were taking measurements near a small tributary of the main creek, Alexandra noticed something unusual partially exposed in the eroded bank, what appeared to be a piece of metal. Curious, she carefully extracted it from the soil. "What have you got there?" Thomas asked, looking up from his notes. Alexandra brushed away the dirt to reveal a tarnished silver pocket watch. The case was dented and the glass cracked, but when she pressed the release, it opened to reveal the watch face and, on the opposite side, a small daguerreotype photograph of a young woman with a solemn expression. "Someone lost this," she murmured. "Perhaps years ago, judging by the condition." "Finders keepers," Thomas suggested. Alexandra shook her head. "No, this belongs to someone. It might be significant to them." She carefully tucked the watch into her pocket. "I'll ask Mr. Turner if he knows anything about it." As the afternoon progressed, dark clouds began gathering over the mountains to the west. The air grew heavy with the promise of rain, and distant thunder rumbled across the valley. "We should head back to camp," Thomas suggested, eyeing the approaching storm. "Those look like serious clouds." Alexandra agreed reluctantly. They'd made good progress, but she'd hoped to complete the eastern section survey by nightfall. As they packed up their equipment, the first fat raindrops began to fall, quickly increasing to a steady downpour. They were still a mile from camp when the storm hit in earnest driving rain that reduced visibility to mere yards, accompanied by cracking lightning and booming thunder. The path back to camp crossed a normally placid stream, but Alexandra was alarmed to see it already swelling with runoff from the hills above. "We need to cross now," she shouted over the storm's roar. "It's rising too quickly," Thomas nodded, his face pale beneath his dripping hat. They urged their horses into the churning water, which was already up to the animals' knees. Halfway across, Alexandra's horse stumbled on a hidden rock, nearly losing its footing. She clung desperately to the saddle horn as the startled animal righted itself and lunged for the opposite bank. They had just reached what seemed like solid ground when the bank beneath them gave way, saturated soil collapsing into the rushing stream. Alexandra felt herself falling as her horse scrambled for purchase. She hit the water hard, the cold shocking the breath from her lungs. The current immediately caught her, tumbling her downstream as she fought to keep her head above water. "Miss Kincaid!" Thomas's panicked cry barely reached her through the storm's fury. Alexandra struggled against the current, but her soaked clothing dragged her down. Just as her strength began to fail, she felt something solid, a tree branch extended into the water. She grabbed it with desperate hands, managing to pull herself partially onto the bank. But the ground was slick with mud, and she couldn't get proper leverage to climb fully out of the raging stream. That's when she saw him, Zachary Turner, riding hard along the bank. He dismounted in one fluid motion and was at the water's edge in seconds, extending his arm toward her. "Take my hand," he shouted. Alexandra reached out, their fingers brushing but failing to connect. The branch she clung to creaked ominously. "It's breaking. I can't." Before she could finish, Zachary was in the water beside her, one arm anchored around a sturdy tree root, the other locked firmly around her waist. With remarkable strength, he hauled her from the stream's grasp and up onto the muddy bank where they both collapsed, gasping for breath. Rain still pelted down, but Alexandra barely noticed it now, acutely aware instead of Zachary's arm still around her, his face inches from hers. For a suspended moment, they simply stared at each other, the shared brush with danger creating an unexpected intimacy. Then Thomas appeared, leading his horse and Alexandra's, which he had managed to catch. "Miss Kincaid, thank God you're all right." Zachary released her immediately, standing and offering a hand to help her up. "Your camp will be flooded," he said. "You'll come to the main house until the storm passes." It wasn't a question or an invitation, but a statement of fact. Alexandra, still breathless from her ordeal, merely nodded. The ride to the ranch house was a blur of driving rain and howling wind. By the time they reached the shelter of the covered porch, Alexandra was shivering uncontrollably despite Zachary's coat, which he had wrapped around her shoulders. Inside, the house was warm and surprisingly comfortable. Simple furnishings of solid craftsmanship. A few bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Clean pine floors covered in places with woven rugs. It spoke of a man who valued function, but didn't entirely neglect comfort. Roy appeared from what must have been the kitchen, alarm evident on his weathered face. "Lord Almighty, what happened?" Creek took Miss Kincaid for a ride, Zachary said tersely. "She needs dry clothes and something hot to drink. Her assistant, too." "I'll fetch some of your things for the lady," Roy said, already moving toward the stairs. "Young man, come with me. I've got some old clothes that might fit you." Left alone with Zachary, Alexandra became acutely aware of her bedraggled state hair plastered to her face, clothes clinging to her body, water pooling around her boots on his clean floor. "I'm sorry about the mess," she said, attempting to regain some dignity. "Floors can be mopped," he replied, then added more softly, "People can't be replaced." Their eyes met again, and Alexandra felt a curious flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her recent brush with drowning. There was concern in his gaze, genuine relief at her safety. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved my life." Something flashed across his features, discomfort perhaps, or some deeper emotion she couldn't identify. Anyone would have done the same, but it was you who did it. She hesitated, then added, "Not everyone would risk themselves for a railroad surveyor who threatens their land." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Maybe I just didn't want to explain a drowned woman on my property to Sheriff Miller. Creates all kinds of paperwork." The joke, unexpected from the serious rancher, startled a laugh from Alexandra. "Heaven forbid you face bureaucracy on my account." Roy returned with clothing, a shirt and trousers that would clearly be too large for her, but dry. "Best I could do, miss." "You can change in the room upstairs, first door on the right. There's a robe there too, if you want to hang your things by the fire to dry." Alexandra thanked him and climbed the stairs, aware of Zachary's eyes following her. The room was clearly his, sparse but neat, with a large bed covered in a handmade quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small desk by the window. A bookshelf held more volumes than she would have expected, and a rifle hung on brackets over the door. She changed quickly, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs of the borrowed clothing. As she was gathering her wet garments, she remembered the pocket watch. Miraculously, it was still in her skirt pocket. She took it out, examining it more carefully in the light from the window. The photograph inside showed a young woman, perhaps 20, with dark hair arranged in the style of the late 1850s or early 1860s. Something about her expression struck Alexandra, a seriousness beyond her years, but with gentle eyes that suggested compassion. On the inside of the case, barely visible through years of tarnish, was an inscription. "To Z, always. E.Z. Could it be Zachary himself?" The watch looked to be 15 or 20 years old, which would put Turner at the right age to have received such a gift in his youth. Alexandra felt a pang of curiosity mixed with something else, a strange reluctance to intrude on what might be a painful memory. She tucked the watch into the pocket of the borrowed trousers and made her way downstairs, where she found Zachary, Thomas, and Roy seated at the kitchen table. A hearty stew was being served, along with fresh bread and coffee. "Just in time," Roy said cheerfully. "Nothing like hot food after a soaking." Alexandra took the empty chair, which happened to be directly across from Zachary. "This is very kind of you both." "Can't let folks starve, even if they are railroad people," Roy winked, ladling stew into her bowl. "Besides, it's not often we get company out here, especially the female variety." "Roy," Zachary said, a warning in his tone. "Just making conversation," the older man replied innocently. "Miss Kincaid must get tired of being surrounded by nothing but men and equipment all day." Thomas, already halfway through his meal, looked up. "Miss Kincaid manages better than most men I know, sir. Saved my hide more than once in Montana when I miscalculated a river depth." "Is that where you're from?" Roy asked Alexandra. "Montana, originally Boston," she replied. "My father was a surveyor there. I followed in his footsteps and eventually found my way west. The work is more interesting here, more challenging." "And your family didn't object to you taking up such an unusual profession?" Roy pressed. Alexandra smiled slightly. "My mother passed when I was young. My father believed a woman could do anything a man could do, given proper training and opportunity. He taught me everything he knew." "He sounds like an unusual man," Zachary observed, the first words he'd spoken since she joined them. "He was," Alexandra agreed, meeting his gaze. "He believed in looking forward, not backward, in building rather than dwelling on what was lost." Something in her words seemed to resonate with Zachary. His expression softened momentarily before he looked down at his plate. The storm continued to rage outside, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling around the eaves. After dinner, Roy produced a bottle of whiskey and 4 glasses. "Medicinal purposes," he declared, pouring modest amounts, "to ward off any chill you might have caught in that creek." They moved to the sitting area where a fire burned cheerfully in the stone hearth. Alexandra's clothes were spread nearby, steaming gently as they dried. The whiskey was good, smooth, and warming, and despite the circumstances, she found herself relaxing. Thomas, exhausted from the day's events, soon dozed off in his chair. Roy, after telling a few colorful stories about his days driving cattle from Texas, excused himself to his quarters in the adjoining building that served as the cookhouse. Left alone with Zachary, Alexandra felt a curious tension in the air, not entirely uncomfortable, but charged with unspoken thoughts. He sat in a leather armchair, firelight playing across his features, making him look younger and somehow more vulnerable than he had in daylight. "Your home is lovely," she said, breaking the silence. "How long have you been here?" "7 years," he replied. "Built most of it myself." "That explains why it feels so cohesive. So many houses seem thrown together without thought to how the spaces relate to each other." He looked at her with mild surprise. "You have an interest in architecture?" "My father believed understanding buildings was essential to surveying properly. We studied architectural principles alongside mathematics and geology." She smiled at the memory. "He said knowing how things are built helps you understand how they might fall apart and how to prevent that." Wise man. He was. Alexandra hesitated, then reached into her pocket. "Mr. Turner, I found something today that I think might belong to you." She held out the silver pocket watch. Zachary went utterly still, his eyes fixed on the tarnished object in her palm. When he finally reached for it, his hand trembled slightly. "Where did you find this?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "In the creek bank where the soil had eroded away." "It must have been buried there for some time." He opened the case, his thumb brushing over the photograph with such tenderness that Alexandra felt like an intruder witnessing something deeply private. For a long moment he simply stared at the image, his expression a complex mixture of pain and longing. "Her name was Emma," he said finally. "Emma Lawson." He closed the watch carefully, holding it tightly in his fist as if afraid it might disappear again. "I thought it was lost forever." The inscription, to Z, always, Alexandra said softly. She was important to you. She was my wife. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Alexandra felt a surprising pang of, what, disappointment. But why should it matter to her if this man had been married? I'm sorry, she said. Is she? Dead, yes. His jaw tightened. 15 years now, Alexandra calculated quickly. If he was around her age, early 30s, that would mean he'd been married very young. You must have been barely more than a boy. 17 when we married. 19 when I lost her. His eyes remained fixed on the fire. Another lifetime, the war, she asked gently, knowing the timing would have coincided with the worst of the Civil War. A bitter laugh escaped him. In a manner of speaking, but not the war you're thinking of. He seemed about to say more, then shook his head. It doesn't matter now. But it did matter. Alexandra could see that clearly. Whatever had happened 15 years ago still haunted this man, had shaped the person he'd become. Thank you for returning this, he said, carefully tucking the watch into his shirt pocket close to his heart. I owe you a debt. You saved my life today, she reminded him. If anything, the debt is mine. His eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a current of understanding, of shared solitude recognized and acknowledged. We should both get some rest, he said finally, standing. You can take my room upstairs. I'll sleep down here. I couldn't possibly, please. The word seemed to cost him something. I insist, Alexandra nodded, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. Thank you, Mr. Turner. Zachary, he said. After fishing someone out of a flood, last names seem overly formal, she smiled. Then you must call me Alexandra. For the first time since she'd met him, he smiled, fully a transformation that caught her breath. Lines appeared at the corners of his eyes, and years seemed to fall away from his face. Alexandra, he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. Sleep well. Upstairs, lying in his bed, surrounded by his possessions and the lingering scent of him soap and leather, and something uniquely his own, Alexandra found herself thinking about Emma Lawson, the solemn-faced young woman in the photograph. What had happened to her? And how had her death sent Zachary Turner fleeing to this remote ranch, where he'd buried not just his past but seemingly his heart as well? As sleep claimed her, Alexandra's last conscious thought was that finding that watch might have uncovered more than just a lost memento. It might have disturbed whatever carefully constructed peace Zachary had built for himself in this valley. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a washed, clean world glistening in the morning sunlight. Zachary was already up when Alexandra descended the stairs, dressed once again in her own clothes, which had dried overnight. He stood at the kitchen window, the recovered pocket watch open in his hand, gazing at the photograph inside. He snapped it closed quickly when he heard her footsteps, tucking it away before turning to greet her. Morning, how did you sleep? Better than I expected after yesterday's excitement, she replied. You, he shrugged. I've had worse nights on that sofa. Roy bustled in from outside, carrying fresh eggs. Beautiful morning after all that ruckus, creek still running high, though. You folks might want to wait another day before heading back to your camp, Alexandra frowned. Our equipment, I sent 2 of my hands to check at first light, Zachary interrupted. Your tent weathered the storm, but everything's muddy. They're bringing back whatever looks important. Surprised by his thoughtfulness, Alexandra thanked him. Thomas appeared moments later, looking refreshed despite his makeshift bed in the sitting room chair over breakfast eggs, bacon, and biscuits that melted in the mouth. They discussed the day ahead. The storm had washed out several areas Alexandra had planned to survey, which meant adjusting their schedule. I could show you the western property line, Zachary offered unexpectedly. There's high ground there that gives a good view of the whole valley, might help with your overall assessment. Alexandra tried not to show her surprise at his sudden cooperation. That would be very helpful, thank you. I can stay here and organize our equipment when it arrives, Thomas suggested. Plot the measurements we've already taken. And so, an hour later, Alexandra found herself riding alongside Zachary across the verdant expanse of his ranch. The storm had left the air unusually clear, offering spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. Wild flowers, their blooms opened by the rain, dotted the meadows with splashes of color. "Your land is beautiful," she remarked as they crested a small hill. "You've done remarkable work here in just 7 years." "The land does the work," he replied. "I just try not to get in its way." "That's a philosophy more men should adopt," she said with a smile. "Too often I see ranchers fighting against the natural features rather than working with them." "Is that what you tell the railroad, to work with the land rather than blast through it?" The question lacked the antagonism she might have expected. Instead, he seemed genuinely curious about her answer. "I try," she admitted. "But the engineers have their own priorities: straightest line, fastest construction, lowest cost. Sometimes they listen to my recommendations about natural watersheds or soil stability. Often they don't. Yet you keep doing the work. Because when they do listen, it matters. One route changed to preserve a Cheyenne burial ground, a bridge redesigned to withstand spring flooding. Small victories, but meaningful ones." He nodded slowly. "I understand that. Sometimes all we can do is the best we can with the position we're in." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, eventually reaching a ridgeline that offered a sweeping vista of the entire valley. Zachary dismounted and helped Alexandra down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "From here, you can see the natural flow of the land," he said, seemingly unaffected by their proximity. He pointed toward the east. "The original stagecoach road followed that ridgeline, but it's too steep for heavy wagons when it rains." Alexandra studied the terrain with professional interest, making mental notes about the various features. But she was also acutely aware of Zachary standing beside her, of the way the breeze ruffled his dark hair, of the strength evident in his tall frame. "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured after they had discussed the topographical features. A wariness entered his expression, but he nodded. "You can ask, I might not answer." "The watch, Emma's watch, how did it end up buried by the creek? It's quite far from the house." Pain flickered across his face. For a moment she thought he would refuse to answer. Then he sighed, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "When I first came here, I used to ride out to that spot to remember her, to talk to her, I suppose, though that sounds foolish now." "It doesn't sound foolish at all," Alexandra said softly. "One day, about a year after I settled here, there was a terrible storm worse than yesterday's. I was angry, raging really, at God, at the world, at myself most of all." His voice grew distant, as if he were seeing that day rather than the present. "I threw the watch into the creek. Immediately regretted it, but the water was too high to find it." A bitter smile twisted his lips. "Seemed fitting somehow, one more loss I'd brought on myself." Alexandra hesitated, then gently touched his arm. "Whatever happened, Zachary, whatever you believe you did or failed to do, carrying that burden alone for 15 years seems punishment enough." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then into her eyes. Something vulnerable and raw showed in his gaze. "Some debts can never be repaid, Alexandra. Some sins can't be absolved." "Perhaps not," she agreed, "but they can be accepted, integrated into who we become, rather than defining us entirely." For a long moment, he seemed to be searching her face for something: judgment, perhaps, or revulsion at whatever dark secret he carried. Finding neither, some of the tension eased from his shoulders. "You're an unusual woman, Alexandra Kincaid, so I've been told," she replied with a small smile. "Usually not as a compliment." "It was meant as one," he assured her, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was prepared to name. Finally, Zachary cleared his throat and gestured toward their horses. "We should head back. Your assistant will be wondering what happened to you." They rode side by side, the silence between them now comfortable rather than strained. As they approached the house, Alexandra could see Thomas outside, examining their surveying equipment that had been retrieved from the camp. "Your men were very helpful," Thomas called as they dismounted. "Everything important survived, though we'll need to dry out some of the paper goods." "Good," Alexandra nodded. "We can resume our survey tomorrow then." She turned to Zachary. "Unless you'd prefer we relocate our camp, stay," he said simply. The creek might rise again with the snowmelt coming down from the mountains. The meadow beside the house is drier. It was a practical suggestion, but Alexandra sensed something more behind it, a reluctance to see her return to the distant campsite. Or perhaps that was merely her own wishful thinking. The next few days established a new rhythm. Alexandra and Thomas worked methodically across the property, mapping and measuring, while Zachary attended to ranch business. But each evening they would gather at the main house for dinner, where conversation gradually became easier, more natural. Zachary revealed himself to be well-read and thoughtful, with a dry wit that emerged when he was relaxed. On the third evening after the storm, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Alexandra decided to address what they'd both been avoiding. "We'll be finishing our survey tomorrow," she said. Zachary nodded, his expression guarded. "You've been thorough." "I've been trying to find alternatives," she admitted. "Ways the railroad could bypass your property entirely or at least impact it minimally." He looked at her with surprise. "Why would you do that?" "Because this place matters to you." "Because you've built something meaningful here," she hesitated. "And because I've come to care what happens to you." The confession hung in the air between them. Zachary's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Alexandra thought she'd overstepped. "Alexandra," he began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. "I know it's inappropriate," she rushed on. "I'm here in a professional capacity, and my personal feelings shouldn't influence my work. But I wanted you to know that my report will reflect every possible alternative to disrupting your ranch." "That's not," he ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "I'm not concerned about your professionalism. I'm concerned about giving you reason to care about a man like me." "A man like you," she echoed. "What exactly does that mean, Zachary?" He stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch. "You don't know me, you don't know what I've done." "Then tell me," she challenged, rising to face him. "Whatever it is you're so determined to punish yourself for, tell me." The struggle was visible on his face, the desire to unburden himself warring with the habit of silence he'd maintained for so long. Finally, he took a deep breath. "I killed them," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Emma and our unborn child. Not with my own hands, but through my actions, my choices. They died because of me." Alexandra felt the blood drain from her face, but she didn't back away. "How?" He laughed, a hollow, painful sound. "You still want the story? Most people would be running for the sheriff by now." "I'm not most people," she said quietly. "And I don't believe you're a murderer, Zachary, so tell me what happened." He turned away, staring out at the darkening landscape. When he spoke, his voice was distant, as if the words were being dragged from somewhere deep within him. "I was a different man then. Young, ambitious. I grew up in Missouri, son of a moderately successful merchant. When the war came, I was 17, too young to fight officially, but old enough to get involved in the border conflicts." Alexandra's mind raced. Missouri, during the Civil War, had been a battleground not just between Union and Confederate forces, but between irregular militia groups conducting brutal raids across the Kansas border. "I fell in with William Quantrill's raiders," he continued, confirming her worst suspicions. "Not because I cared about the Confederacy or slavery, God help me, I didn't think about any of that. I was angry at the world, looking for excitement, for a purpose. Quantrill offered that to disaffected young men like me." He paused, his knuckles white where he gripped the porch railing. "I told myself we were fighting for a cause, defending our homes, but the things we did, there was no justifying them. Lawrence, Kansas was the worst. We killed over 150 men and boys, burned the town. I can still smell the smoke sometimes, hear the screams." Alexandra's throat tightened with horror, but she remained silent, sensing he needed to continue uninterrupted. "After Lawrence, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I left Quantrill's men, went back home to Jefferson City. Met Emma there, the daughter of a Union sympathizer, ironically enough. She saw something in me worth saving. We married quickly before her father could object." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "She was so full of life, so determined to build a future beyond the war." His voice grew strained. but the past doesn't stay buried. A man recognized me in town one day, someone who'd lost family in Lawrence. Word spread. A group came for me one night looking for revenge. I wasn't home. His breathing became ragged. Emma was. Alexandra closed her eyes briefly, already understanding where the story was headed. They burned our home with her inside. She was 6 months pregnant with our child. By the time I returned, there was nothing left but ashes. He turned to face her, his eyes hollow. So you see, I didn't kill them with my own hands. I killed them by being the man I was, by the choices I made before I ever knew them. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of his confession. Alexandra struggled to reconcile the brutal young raider with the man standing before her, a man who had built this peaceful place, who had risked his life to save hers, whose touch had been so gentle. "You changed your name," she said finally. It wasn't a question, he nodded. "Zachary Turner died in that fire too. I was born Jacob Thornton. And you've been running ever since." "Not just running," he corrected. "Trying to atone, if such a thing is possible, trying to become someone Emma could have been proud of, even knowing it's too late." Alexandra moved closer to him, close enough to see the torment in his eyes. "The boy who rode with Quantrill made terrible choices, Jacob, but that boy isn't the man standing before me now, isn't he?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "The blood doesn't wash away, Alexandra." "Trust me, I've tried." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't wash away, but it can be balanced by the good a person does afterward, by the lives they touch, the kindness they show." She took a deep breath. "Emma saw something in you worth loving even then. Do you think she would want you to spend your life in solitary penance?" Something broke in his expression, a wall crumbling after standing for too many years. "I don't know how to be anything else," he admitted. "I don't know how to forgive myself." "Perhaps you start by accepting forgiveness from others," she suggested softly. "From those who see you not as you were, but as you are." Their eyes held, and Alexandra felt a current of understanding pass between them, deeper than attraction, more complex than simple affection. She saw in him not just the darkness he'd confessed, but the light he'd been cultivating in its shadow, slowly. Giving him every opportunity to pull away, she reached up and touched his face. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, his beard rough against her palm. He remained perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might shatter this fragile moment. "I should go," she whispered, even as her body leaned closer to his. "My work here is almost done." "Is it?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "The survey, yes," she smiled faintly. "As for the rest, I'm not certain we've even begun." His hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his cheek. Alexandra, whatever he might have said, was interrupted by Thomas calling from inside the house. "Miss Kincaid, are you out there? I've found something in the calculations you should see." The moment broken, they stepped apart. Zachary Jacob looked at her with a mixture of regret and relief. "Your assistant needs you." "We're not finished with this conversation," she said firmly. "Promise me that." After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "I promise." But the opportunity to resume their discussion didn't come that night. Thomas had indeed found something significant, a discrepancy in their measurements that required immediate attention. By the time they resolved it, the hour was late, and the household had retired. The next morning, Alexandra rose early, determined to complete the survey and to speak with Zachary again before any more time passed. But when she went downstairs, Roy informed her that Zachary had ridden out before dawn with 2 of his hands to check on cattle in the north pasture. He wouldn't return until evening. Disappointed but resolute, Alexandra threw herself into her work. She and Thomas completed the final measurements by mid-afternoon, and she spent the remaining daylight hours at the small desk in her room, compiling her report. As promised, she detailed every possible alternative to running the railroad through the heart of the Turner ranch. As twilight fell, she heard horses in the yard, Zachary returning. Her heart quickened at the prospect of seeing him, of continuing their conversation from the previous night, but when she went downstairs, Roy met her with an apologetic expression. "Boss is in a state," he warned. 3 head of cattle found dead up North Mountain Lion. Looks like he's gone to his room and doesn't want to be disturbed. Disappointment settled heavily in her chest, but Alexandra nodded her understanding. "We'll be leaving tomorrow," she told Roy. "Our work here is complete. Please thank Mr. Turner for his hospitality." "You're not waiting to speak with him yourself?" Roy asked, surprise evident in his weathered face. She hesitated. "I think perhaps it's better this way, cleaner." The old cook studied her face, seeming to see more than she wished to reveal. "Miss Kincaid, in all the years I've known that man, I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Whatever he's told you about himself, and I suspect it's more than he's told anyone in a long while, it hasn't changed that fact." Alexandra felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "Some wounds run too deep, Roy. Some ghosts are too powerful to exorcise." "Maybe," he conceded. "Or maybe the right person can help heal those wounds, can help quiet those ghosts. Ever think of that?" She had no answer for him. That night, Alexandra slept fitfully, torn between her professional duties and her personal feelings. By morning, she had made her decision. She and Thomas packed their equipment and prepared to depart just after breakfast. She left her completed report on the desk in the study, along with a brief note thanking Zachary for his hospitality. They were loading the wagon when she heard the door of the main house open. Looking up, she saw Zachary standing on the porch, her report in his hand. "You're leaving," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he approached the wagon. "Our survey is complete," she replied, equally measured. "The company expects my return by the end of the week." "I see." He glanced at the report. "You've been thorough. I've been honest," she corrected. "The eastern route through your property is the most efficient, but I've provided 3 viable alternatives, each with their own merits." Thomas, sensing the tension, discreetly moved away to check the horses, leaving them relatively alone. "Thank you for that," Zachary said. Then lower, "And thank you for listening, for not judging." "I judged the man before me, not the boy you described," she replied softly. "The man who saved my life, the man who treats his workers with respect and stewards his land with care, the man who keeps books of poetry beside his bed." Something flickered in his eyes, hope, perhaps, quickly shadowed by doubt. "And what verdict did you reach?" Alexandra took a deep breath. "That I would like to know him better. That one conversation on a porch isn't enough to determine what might be possible between us." "Alexandra," he broke off, clearly struggling with what to say next. "I haven't allowed myself to think about a future with anyone since Emma. I'm not sure I know how anymore." "I'm not asking for promises," she said, "only possibility." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of lighter blue in his eyes. "When will you return to Denver?" "I'll submit my report next week. After that, I'll likely be assigned to another survey, Idaho perhaps, or Wyoming. And if I asked you to come back here first?" His voice was low, tentative. "To give us time to explore those possibilities." Her heart leapt at the suggestion, but caution tempered her response. "The company wouldn't approve of personal entanglements affecting my work." "To hell with the company," he said, a hint of the old fire flashing in his eyes. "I'm asking about you, Alexandra. What do you want?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. What did she want? She'd built her life around her work, around proving herself in a man's world. Personal attachments had always seemed a luxury she couldn't afford. Yet standing here, looking into Jacob's eyes, she found herself wanting more than professional accomplishment. "I want to know if there's something real between us," she admitted. "Something beyond the drama of storms and rescues and confessions, something that could grow in ordinary moments." He nodded slowly, understanding. "Then come back, not as a surveyor, not for the railroad, come back for those ordinary moments." "And what about your past?" she asked gently. "Can you live in the present with me, Jacob? Can you look toward a future instead of always backward?" At the use of his real name, something in him seemed to settle a recognition and acceptance. "I don't know," he answered honestly, "but for the first time in 15 years, I want to try." The simple declaration moved her more than any elaborate promises could have. Alexandra reached out, taking his hand in hers. His fingers curled around hers, warm and strong and steady. 3 weeks, she said. "I'll need 3 weeks to complete my business in Denver. Then I can return for a visit to start." Hope bloomed fully in his eyes now. "I'll be here," he promised. Thomas cleared his throat discreetly from beside the wagon, indicating they needed to depart if they were to reach town by nightfall. Alexandra reluctantly released Jacob's hand. 3 weeks, she repeated. As the wagon pulled away, Alexandra looked back to see him standing in the yard, watching her go. For the first time since she'd met him, he seemed unburdened, not entirely free of his ghosts, perhaps, but no longer defined by them either. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. In Denver, Alexandra submitted her report, emphasizing the alternative routes that would spare the Turner ranch. The chief engineer grumbled about increased costs, but grudgingly acknowledged the merits of her southern route option, which would serve additional settlements while adding only 7 miles to the line. With her professional obligations fulfilled, Alexandra faced a more personal dilemma: how to explain her planned return to Silver Creek to her employers. In the end, she requested a month's leave of absence, citing a need to conduct independent research on seasonal water flow patterns in the region. It wasn't entirely a fabrication. Such research would indeed be valuable for future projects. As the stagecoach carried her back towards Silver Creek, Alexandra found herself both excited and nervous. What if Jacob had changed his mind? What if the connection they'd felt had been merely circumstantial, a product of dramatic events rather than genuine compatibility? The coach arrived in Silver Creek late in the afternoon. Alexandra had sent word ahead of her arrival, but the dusty main street showed no sign of Jacob waiting for her. Trying to quell her disappointment, she collected her trunk from the coach and arranged for a room at the town's small hotel. She was signing the register when the door opened behind her, letting in a gust of wind along with heavy footsteps. Before she could turn, a familiar voice sent warmth spreading through her. "I hope you haven't committed to that room yet." Alexandra turned to find Jacob standing just inside the doorway, hat in hand, a hesitant smile playing at his lips. He looked different somehow, his hair trimmed, his clothes newer, his bearing more open. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten," she said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "Never." He crossed the room to stand before her. "I was delayed by a meeting with the mayor." "I have something to tell you." The hotel clerk, sensing a private moment, discreetly moved away, leaving them relatively alone in the small lobby. "What is it?" Alexandra asked. "The railroad has officially announced its southern route. Your alternative was approved." His smile broadened. "My ranch will remain intact thanks to you." Relief and professional satisfaction flooded through her. "That's wonderful news, Jacob. There's more," he continued. "The town council approached me about serving as Silver Creek's representative in territorial negotiations. With the railroad coming, they want someone who understands both ranching interests and progress." A self-deprecating laugh escaped him. Ironic that they'd choose me, of all people. Alexandra understood the significance of what he was telling her. By accepting such a position, Jacob was stepping out of the shadows, engaging with the community, looking toward the future instead of hiding from his past. "You said yes," she asked softly. He nodded. "I said I'd consider it, depending on certain personal factors." His eyes held hers steadily. "One factor in particular," her heart quickened. "And what factor might that be?" "Whether the woman I've been thinking about for 3 weeks straight might consider making Silver Creek her home, not just for a visit, but permanently." The boldness of the statement, so different from his earlier hesitation, took her breath away. "Jacob, we barely know each other." "I know," he acknowledged, "but I know enough to recognize something rare, something worth pursuing. The details we can discover those together day by day." "And my work?" she asked. "My career is important to me." "As it should be," he agreed. "Silver Creek needs a skilled surveyor as much as Denver does, maybe more, with all the development coming. You could establish your own practice here, take the clients you choose, set your own terms." He had clearly given this considerable thought. The idea was appealing: independence, challenging work, and the chance to explore whatever was growing between them. "You make a compelling argument, Mr. Turner," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "Or should I say, Mr. Thornton?" His expression grew serious. That's something else I wanted to tell you. I've decided to reclaim my birth name gradually, starting with the council position. No more hiding. The significance of this decision wasn't lost on Alexandra. It represented more than a change of name. It was an acceptance of his whole self, past included. Jacob Thornton, she said, testing the name. It suits you? There's a small house in town, he continued, his words coming faster now as if he feared losing momentum. Nothing grand but solid. I've arranged to purchase it as an office for you to start, and perhaps, eventually, as something more for us. He took a deep breath. I know this is fast, Alexandra. I know there are 1,000 reasons to be cautious. But something happened when you found that watch, when you unearthed my past without flinching from it. You helped me see that I've been half alive all these years. Alexandra felt tears threatening. And what about Emma? She asked gently. Will there always be a ghost between us? Jacob reached into his pocket and withdrew the silver watch. I visited her family in Kansas, he said quietly, made my peace as best I could. Some forgave me, some didn't, but I needed to face them before I could truly offer you my future. He opened the watch, showing her the photograph inside. Emma will always be part of my past. I won't dishonor her memory by pretending otherwise, but you're the possibility of happiness I never thought I'd find again. He closed the watch and held it out to her. I'd like you to have this. Startled, Alexandra shook her head. Jacob, I couldn't, not as a morbid keepsake, he explained, but as a promise. Emma taught me how to love once. The watch coming back to me through you feels like her blessing to love again. His voice grew husky. To love you, Alexandra, if you'll give me that chance. The simple, heartfelt declaration moved her beyond words. Slowly, she accepted the watch, feeling its weight and history in her palm. I haven't said I'm staying, she reminded him, though they both knew her resolve was weakening. Jacob smiled a full, genuine smile that transformed his face. Then let me convince you. He glanced toward the hotel clerk, who was pointedly not watching them, starting with rescuing you from this establishment. Roy's prepared dinner at the ranch. He's been cooking for 2 days straight in anticipation of your return. Alexandra laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Well, I can't disappoint Roy, can I? Is that your only reason for coming? Jacob asked, a hint of vulnerability beneath the teasing. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. No, she said softly. That's not my only reason. Outside, Jacob's wagon waited. As he helped her up to the seat, his hands lingering at her waist, Alexandra felt a certainty settle over her. The path ahead wasn't entirely clear. There would be adjustments, compromises, challenges to navigate. But the man beside her was worth those uncertainties. As they rode out of town toward the ranch that might one day be their shared home, Alexandra looked at Jacob's profile against the setting sun. The ghosts hadn't vanished entirely, perhaps they never would. But they had been acknowledged, accepted, integrated into the man he had become. And that man, complicated, honorable, wounded but healing, was someone she could envision building a future with. Tell me about this house in town, she said, leaning slightly against his shoulder. Does it have room for a proper drafting table? I have ideas for improvements to the irrigation system in the South Valley. Jacob's laugh, free and unguarded, rang out across the open land. Already planning to remake the landscape, Miss Kincaid. Only improving what's already there, Mr. Thornton, she replied with a smile. Only bringing to light what's been waiting to flourish. He glanced at her, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. Then I look forward to seeing what grows between us. As the wagon rolled on toward home, Alexandra knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had recognized in each other not just who they were, but who they might become. In the years that followed, the story of Jacob Thornton and Alexandra Kincaid became something of a legend in Silver Creek. How a surveyor mapping a railroad route had unearthed not just a silver watch but a man's buried heart. How love had bloomed in the unlikeliest soil, between a woman who charted paths forward and a man who had been trapped in his past. Their wedding, held the following spring beneath the cottonwood trees by the creek where they had first connected. brought together the entire community, ranch hands and townspeople, alike celebrating the union of two souls who had found in each other both redemption and promise. Jacob served on the town council for 10 years, helping guide Silver Creek through the transformation brought by the railroad's arrival. Alexandra established the region's most respected surveying practice, her expertise sought after throughout the territory. Together, they expanded the ranch, making it a model of progressive land management that drew visitors from as far away as San Francisco. And on cool evenings, when the work was done, they could often be seen on their porch, watching the sunset, his arm around her shoulders, her head against his chest, two people who had learned that even the deepest wounds could heal, given time and love and the courage to begin again. The silver watch remained on their mantelpiece not as a ghost between them, but as a reminder that the past, with all its pain and loss, had led them to each other. That sometimes, what seems buried forever is merely waiting to be discovered by the right hands, the right heart. And in the laughter of their children, two daughters and a son who grew up knowing both their father's full story and their mother's strength, the final pieces of Jacob's redemption could be heard. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but finding a way forward. Building a life not defined by what had been lost, but by what had been found in a creek bed in a storm in each other's arms. The cowboy had buried his past in the dust, but she had unearthed it with love and in doing so had given them both a future neither had dared imagine.